Thanks so much to all of you. That was indeed fascinating. Thanks, David. I think, Ahmed, your final point, closing on investing in universities, is a good one to end on, so I appreciate that. And it gives you just a small snapshot of some of the really world-class research that Columbia professors are doing into so many important energy issues, CCS just being one of them, but we could have picked literally any issue that matters to global energy markets. Another thing that matters to global energy markets, as you all talked about, were how technology is going to develop, how the future of demand is going to develop. We talked, you heard earlier on the one of the panels here, a lot of questions and uncertainty about what the outlook for oil demand will be. And that's going to be determined in part by technology innovation, in part by policy. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time to close this out, talking about the future of transportation, and hear from one of the companies that's doing extraordinarily transformative, innovative stuff that affects how many of us get around every day, but is going to dramatically change that, I think, when you look out into the future. I'll let Dan Yergin introduce our panelists. Please, Dan and Jeff, you can both come up now. I will just introduce Dan. If any of you need me to introduce Dan, you're probably in the wrong room. The phrase, he needs no introduction, gets overused, but I think that's accurate with Dan. You all know him as a historian of the energy sector, widely regarded as one of the world's leading energy experts, founder of Cambridge Energy Research Associates, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for the prize, currently vice chair of IHS Markit. And most importantly, for us, a very actively involved and very generous member of the Center on Global Energy Policy's advisory board. He's been a friend and mentor to me personally and to Columbia for many years, and is always wonderful to welcome Dan to this annual conference and so much more that we do at Columbia. So thank you for all of that, Dan, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Jason. Congratulate you and the Center on this terrific program, and of course SEPA on its 70th anniversary. I'm really pleased to be here with Jeff. I think this is a very great way to kind of really round out the discussion. And I was thinking that not a few, but Jeff, I think probably vast majority of people are here are your customers. So
how many have heard of Uber?
Yeah, how many? Raise your hand if you've heard of Uber.
Like maybe a quarter of the room. Okay, great.
Oh, come on, it's higher than that. They're just shy. So Jeff was at Amazon, where he developed the supply chain, and then he developed something called Amazon Prime, which I think has also touched many people's lives. He was on Groupon, and then he went to Uber. So Jeff, I wanted to just begin by asking, where were you when you first heard about Uber, and what was your reaction?
I was actually in Chicago working for Groupon, and it was a word of mouth thing, which is, as I've learned, is a large part of how Uber spreads. And my wife and I were going to go out to dinner, and we were like, you know what, we're going to probably have a few drinks. Like, why don't we try this service, because we don't have to deal with parking. We don't, they'll drive us home, more safely than we'll drive ourselves probably. And we just never went back. It was awesome.
So how was that first ride?
Perfect. I mean, I pushed a button in front of my house, and the car showed up in like 1 minute, and it was just magical. It's just everything was perfect. It just dropped us right in front of the restaurant. I didn't have to deal with any hassle.
And so how many years from there was it until you actually went to Uber?
I guess like a year and a half after that I went to Uber.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Uber's had this fantastic growth. You call it hyper growth. Why has it grown so quickly?
It's, disruption waves really have two primary drivers. One of them is 10x better experience, and one of them is a much lower cost. And so if you can do either one of those, you'll disrupt another industry, or you'll create a wave. If you do both of them, you get hyper growth, and Uber definitely does both of those things. And by comparison specifically to taxi, it's actually dramatically grown the pie overall for transportation, urban mobility. But it's both less expensive and a much better experience. And so that's what has caused it.
So if you take San Francisco as a case study, have you taken business away from taxis, or have it created a whole new market?
It's actually very interesting. You would think it was just like people moving over from taxi to Uber, but it's such a better experience that actually there was a whole latent demand for transportation that wasn't being served. And so taxi hasn't grown that much in San Francisco, but it hasn't really shrunk that much. And this just plays out all over the world. But Uber's business alone is multiples of what taxi was when we started the business in San Francisco. So the overall pie for urban mobility in this way has just grown radically.
I mean, I have the sense in Washington, D.C. that it's also just drawn people from mass transportation. Do you see that?
Not so much, no. It's more of a complement to mass transportation. What we see, like there's a great example is in London, in the outer boroughs of London, like morning rush hour, we actually did an analysis on this. It's something like 30% of trips end within 200 meters of a tube station or of a train station, which is really interesting because people are using it as a kind of a multimodal way of form of transportation.
So we read about protests and challenges with regulators in different parts of the world. What are some of the challenges that you had from both regulators and incumbents? How do those experiences vary across regions, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's sort of become sort of a really key aspect of Uber's culture is how do you deal with kind of regulatory the regulatory environment, the legal environment when it's set up to sort of not do what we're doing. And we have one of our internal values, cultural values is called principled confrontation, because when we decide to confront, we want to be on a very principled basis, for good principled reasons, and we want to do it in a principled way. And so the kinds of things that we've seen are generally, like the way to think about regulation is essentially is there to protect the status quo. And so if you want to do anything different from the status quo, you're going to bump into regulatory barriers. And so, but changing regulation is very difficult. It's a very, very slow process. There are entrenched interests. Taxi lobby is a great example of that, where there's financial interests and so forth for not changing those laws or for being protectionist. And so to get those to change, one of the sort of most effective tools is that we just go into a city and start to operate and demonstrate the value that Uber creates, demonstrate to the populace of that city. And then if it gets to the point where there's, usually it just leads to a very calm kind of resolution on the regulatory front. The ones you read about in the paper are the ones that aren't calm. And when that happens, what we do is we basically shine a bright light on the situation by asking the consumers who are using, the riders who are using the service and the drivers, are they okay with this being shut down? And to vote with their feet with regard to and their emails and their phone calls to the regulators and and kind of politicians in the city, and that's been very effective.
Is there a particular city you can give an example of how it unfolded?
Well, there's actually, San Francisco, when the first very, very early days, our first city of operation, we received a cease and desist letter from the city, and we just kept operating, and it was actually very interesting because
what did you do with the letter?
It's actually framed.
Okay.
It had to be, right?
Right, exactly.
And so what that led to ultimately was a lot of negotiation and back and forth with CPUC there, which is the body that governs the transportation of the city, and ultimately got its resolution, and some of I think actually the first ride-sharing laws and legislation were done in San Francisco.
Right. So one of the mantras of Uber, as I understand, in addition to principled confrontation, is big, bold bets. Tell us about a big, bold bet.
We have several. It's big, bold bets basically says if you're not planting the seeds for 5 to 10 years out, you have no company in 5 to 10 years. And actually, in my role, I spend virtually all my time thinking about the future of Uber and planting those seeds. So self-driving vehicles at Uber, is one of the initiatives I spearheaded, basically on the realization that if we did not, we had a choice to make, which was that we could either usher in self-driving technology or we could be disrupted by it. Those were the two choices, and that was.
So you definitely saw it coming.
Saw it coming. It wasn't super obvious back then. It was reasonable people could disagree about the way that would play out, but when I thought about the kind of playing the chess game out, I said, well, look, I don't think the technology. I think there's a very high probability the technology will not be readily available, and that somebody will, in a proprietary way, develop this technology and use it in order to build a self-driving version of Uber. And when and if that day comes, that company will be able to offer, I'm not naming any names, that company will be able to offer a much, much lower, like an order of magnitude cheaper ride than a human-driven ride. And that's obviously, that's kind of, I mentioned earlier that disruption waves happen because of much lower cost or 10x better experience. That's actually going to be both again, but now in our rearview mirror. So that's what led to us. And this is the kind of work we do in one of my team's advanced programs. Another example of big bold bets is urban aviation. And so, you guys have probably seen a lot of the coverage on flying cars. I hate that term because I don't think urban aviation will have anything to do with flying cars. A flying car is a car that you can drive on the road and you can fly around in, and I don't think that's the right design. It's not just I don't think it. There's a lot of really good technical evidence for that not being the right design. But we recently published a white paper that outlined essentially our thought process from asking the question, why aren't people flying in and around cities today? Like, why in the Bay Area, for example, do people have to wait in traffic and take 90 minutes to go from San Francisco to Palo Alto or vice versa? And there's that pattern, it repeats itself all over the world. And we found the answer, and we figured out why it wasn't done with it couldn't be done with helicopters. And we backed ourselves into an aircraft design and an entire sort of a solution to the whole ecosystem problem. And we spearheaded a thing we call Uber Elevate, which is urban aviation that we think will play out over the next several years.
So are you actually involved in designing these new non-flying cars?
We are not building thank you. We are not building the aircraft ourselves, but what we are doing is we're providing the mission specification, if you will. So that leads to a vehicle specification, a set of parameters for a vehicle, not in specific design, but a set of parameters that the design has to kind of line up with. Right. And that's how we're approaching it.
So on autonomous vehicles, what's your sense of timing?
I think we're going to start seeing the first non-safety driver, so no driver in the driver's seat, trips in the next year to 2 years, and it could even be this year, but it's moving very fast. But what's going to happen is it's going to start on a very small scale. So the nice thing about ride sharing and self-driving together is that you can sort of feather in the self-driving case. You can cherry pick the trips, and you can say only for these trips under these certain conditions are we going to do self-driving. All the rest of the trips will be human-driven, and then you can slowly turn up the dial on what trips are done self-driving. And so it provides a nice glide path for introducing the technology. So it'll start very soon. The question is really what is the ramp, and how quickly does the technology get to the point where it can handle some of the most complex trips, like that long tail of tricky situations. And that's unknown. I mean, my guess is over 5 years it gets to scale.
All right. You mentioned you needed to find the best robotics team, and maybe you might say a word about how you found them and how you brought them to California.
Yeah. So the way I approached self-driving was, we had no self-driving unit at Uber. It was a from scratch kind of thing. And so what I figured out was, and this didn't take a big leap, is that we needed robotics talent. We needed very deep technical robotics talent. This is a robotics problem. And so I basically canvassed the world. I did what I call the network closure of robotics talent, which is you basically call up some of the best people in the world and say, hey, this is what we want to do. Who should we be talking to, and what can you teach me? So you sort of learn a lot about the space, and you also sort of figure out more people you should be talking to, and you keep following those leads until you start hearing the same names over and over again. You've kind of talked to everybody, and it doesn't take as long as you would think in a space like robotics. And so we found the hotspots in the world where this talent was congregates, and Carnegie Mellon. We found a startup at Carnegie Mellon with some ex-CMU professors that called Carnegie Robotics that had this great concentration of people who are just perfect for this, and we bought the company, and that formed the nucleus of the Uber self-driving team.
So the legend that you lifted out the whole department is not true.
Well, see, the next step was it is not true. We did not lift out the whole department. That's correct. We did. A lot of people from CMU did come over because they were very close with. They were in the network of the people at Carnegie Robotics, and so that a lot of recruiting happened there. But it was overall I think CMU and Uber have a great relationship, and it's ultimately a very good thing for CMU that Uber planted a flag in Pittsburgh.
Right. And is it your bet that these autonomous vehicles will primarily be gasoline-powered, electric-powered, mixed?
They are all of our vehicles today are hybrid. and that was in part done because
You mean all your autonomous vehicles?
autonomous vehicles. Sorry, I didn't say. Yeah, all of our self-driving cars today are hybrids. I think that what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of pressure to move to electric vehicles, and the pressure will be economically driven. I don't mean like regulatory pressure. That might happen too, but I don't think that's the right way to get there at all. The reason there'll be pressure is because electric vehicles are just simpler in design. They have fewer moving parts. They don't wear out as quickly. And in ride sharing generally, this is a ride sharing phenomenon. In ride sharing in general, you want your vehicles to actually last a lot longer, and so the economics are swamped by kind of cost per mile. So you want your fuel cost to be as low as possible, and you want the maintenance cost to be as low as possible. You want the vehicles to last as long as possible, so you can amortize them over a longer period of time. And so there's this natural pressure to move there. So we started with hybrid, but I think it'll quickly move to electric. And once, what I'd love to see is for governments to invest, in terms of thinking about infrastructure investment, build out charging networks, for example, to lower the barrier to being able to do an all electric, ride-sharing network.
So if you don't have drivers, it means that you don't have somebody who owns the car. Who will own these cars? Will you be a fleet ownership model?
We probably won't own most of the cars. We might own some of the cars. If you look at like the airline industry, for example, there are there are companies that own airplanes and lease them, right?
Right.
So there's a kind of a new kind of industry that forms around this where there will be fleet owners, and those could be vehicle manufacturers, those could be third parties who are looking for an annuity basically to participating in the revenue stream of the entire ride-sharing industry. So that's, I think, how it's going to play out.
Right. So on big, bold bets, would you put Uber Pool under that as well?
Absolutely. I should have actually mentioned that. Uber Pool was very interesting because it sort of happened as an artifact of scale. So as we grew, the business was growing very, very rapidly. We started noticing, in fact, an engineering team, some engineers on a team noticed that tons of our trips were happening in a completely concurrent way, meaning that people were requesting within a very small radius of each other at roughly the same time, and they were going to roughly the same place, a very small radius of a destination at roughly the same time. So there's a large trip overlap. And so we realized that we could actually serve those trips with one vehicle. And carpooling is one of these things that just has never worked. In 1980, I did some reading around this when we were doing Uber Pool. And 1980 was kind of the peak year. It got to something like 13 or 14%, or it might have been like 19%. And I think it was like 19% of kind of commute trips were carpool, and that was like under extreme kind of fuel cost conditions and so forth. It's down to 9% now, sort of outside of Uber. Uber in San Francisco at our peak city for Uber Pool is 50% of trips, our pool trips, and it's 25% globally across all of our cities. And that's an astounding concept that you literally, it's on-demand ride sharing. I mean, pooling, you push a button and you get a car just like before, but now there's someone in it, or there will be someone in it soon. And we can actually statistically estimate when you'll get to your destination, so you have certainty there. And we've done a ton of iteration on the product to make it a very usable and user-friendly product, and I'm blown away by how well that works.
So what's been the pickup then so far? I mean,
pickup meaning like what the utilization is?
Yeah,
How many people are using it?
I don't know if you measure number of people or number of rides.
Yeah, well, I was saying 50% in San Francisco, 25% across the entire network. Yeah,
right.
So we have 55 million, kind of monthly active riders. So there you can sort of do the math on that too. That's global.
Global,
yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it's 25% of trips in New York City are Uber Pool. So it's a really good pickup. And the great thing about Pool, the sort of the strategic value of this, I mean, what Uber really ultimately wants to do, right, is decongest cities. I like to describe it as unlocking the resources of a city for people. Like it took me a half an hour to get here from my hotel. That trip should have been 5 or 7 minutes. And we have incredible congestion. We have poor utilization of vehicles. We have hunks of sheet metal sitting all over the place because privately owned cars, are 96% unutilized. They get 4% utilization. With a ride-sharing network, you get very high utilization rates, 80% utilization, that kind of thing in a mature network. And when you get Uber Pool, you actually kind of like get past 100%, and it's pretty exciting. You're taking cars off the road. You're taking parking. It's like up to a third of cities is parking space, which is amazing. There's like 8 billion parking spaces in the United States, which is an astounding number. And I mean, like literally, that's the number. And so imagine reclaiming all that land because you don't have to park anymore. I mean, these are the kinds of things Uber's really excited about. And Pool was one of those. It was a big bold bet because like we had no idea if people would actually go for it or what the what the elasticity would be around like how much do people value having their own vehicle, And it turns out that it wasn't a huge cost. I mean, if the economics worked, even on existing ride sharing, and when we do it with self-driving, it'll even make it more compelling.
You mentioned when we were talking before that some statistics show a drop in young people wanting driver's license. Yeah. Is that because of Uber?
I mean, it's I don't know that we can prove causation. The timing, the correlation is strong. One thing that does appear to be causational, or imply causation more strongly, is that we asked our younger riders, people below the age of 30. How they felt about owning a car, what their plans were, and whether they had changed their plans since using Uber. And the answer, for 10% of them said, I have decided because of Uber not to purchase another car or to give up my current car. That's like a kind of a crazy number. Like you think about like how it patched people out of their vehicles, their cars, right? Like when I was a kid and I got my driver's license, that was like a coming of age moment, like escaping the prison of my home or whatever. I don't know.
And now you can go to social network and Uber.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now you just sit in your room and look at your phone.
Yeah.
But it was like a huge moment. So it's amazing to see that kind of a double-digit percentage shift like that. Is kind of amazing. And we haven't even gotten to the point yet where the economics are such that we're actually cheaper than car ownership in all cases. And that's a
you have gotten there.
We have not gotten there yet. No, in some dense urban cores we are cheaper when you take parking into consideration, all this stuff. But in general, it's not always the case. If you use Uber, it's going to be cheaper than owning a car. But it's going to become like ridiculously clearly cheaper with self-driving. That's what makes it really exciting, because at that point it'll just be economically irrational to own a vehicle.
So somebody just sent up a question: why are self-driving cars good for Uber?
Why are they good for Uber?
Yeah.
Well, Uber is like, the way to think about self-driving in Uber is Uber's trying to provide this ubiquitous transportation at the lowest possible price for everyone everywhere. And if you want to be ubiquitous, you have to have huge numbers of people. If you want to kind of get all the benefits of ubiquity and be able to provide short ETAs and et cetera, you need to drive the cost of the product down as far as it can possibly be. And self-driving does that. So self-driving provides a way for us to get the cost down to kind of the minimum possible cost, and like I said, below the cost of car ownership. Ultimately, we see as the kind of our sort of bogey is private car ownership. We think that's the really interesting thing to solve, because we think that's the major problem with cities in terms of mobility. And so we see this as a way of kind of surmounting that, and that's why it's exciting for us to do self-driving.
So you talked about how you wanted a driver's license. Do you see the same thing in your daughter?
No, she was like not excited about getting her driver's license, and I was like, "What is wrong with you?" But I had to kind of like walk the Uber line,
Yes,
I was like, "That's excellent, good
right.
idea, good thinking." And actually, it's kind of exciting.
And you live in California, where
yeah. Well, also she's 17, and like I don't really want a 17-year-old driving a car. Like it seems like if you can just skip right to like 25 or something, it'd be way better. Yeah. I also have 2 sons, and I'm scared to death of them driving. So hopefully by then they'll just be completely irrational, and nobody will own cars at that point.
So what's the automobile industry's reaction to Uber? Can you measure it? I mean,
it's not. I don't know if it's measurable in any kind of quantifiable way.
Well, no, but in terms of
I mean, like, well, we're obviously we're working. You've seen publicly. We're working with Volvo, and as you can imagine, other vehicle manufacturers on the self-driving initiative. And we've done leasing programs with vehicle manufacturers. I mean, there's actually a very nice collaboration with the industry. The thing that I think is the big open question is, in a world of ride sharing, especially self-driven, like really efficient ride sharing at massive scale, do you just produce a lot fewer cars? Like the sort of the demand, as I mentioned earlier, the demand for vehicles is going to shift to a very durable vehicle that serves ride-sharing cases really well. And when that happens, the question is, will you need as many cars produced per year as there are today? And I think the answer is no. And so the auto industry is sort of, I think, figuring that out and like trying to figure out kind of how their role shifts over time and like what the future looks like. So I think there's some uncertainty there. But other than that, we've collaborated really well with the auto manufacturers.
So you have almost 2 million drivers, I think, in the world now.
Yeah,
incredible.
Between 1.5 and 2.
2 million. But out there's this vision of autonomous vehicles. How do you square those two with the drivers?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a technology that is coming whether Uber ushers it in or not, and I think that it won't be one of these things that like you wake up one morning and all the trips are done autonomously. It's like I said earlier, it's going to start off slow, it's going to build, and I think people will have time to adapt to that. Like it's going to become normal in society to have self-driven cars. That'll become the norm over the course of several years. And so I think when things change like sort of acutely or instantly, that's when things are kind of freaky tricky and people get really upset. When things move slowly, you have time to adapt and adjust your lifestyle accordingly. And I think that's what's going to happen. So until then, we have a long period of time where the value proposition we provide to drivers is exceptionally strong and will continue to be exceptionally strong. And we'll be adding tons and tons of drivers. We're still on this extreme growth curve with drivers. That'll still be happening even while self-driving is being ushered in for quite a long time.
Right. So how does one become a driver?
Yeah. Are you interested?
I have some spare time.
Okay, right after this, yeah. If you have a good driving record, you can literally just apply right through the Uber website, or and you'll have your credentials. You'll have to submit some credentials. You'll have a background check conducted on you, and if you pass all those things, you have to have a vehicle check and a couple other steps. But it's a pretty rapid process, and then you're on. And the beauty of the whole model is that you can switch on. It's a new work model. Like, it's a new form of work that I think has also been one of the most exciting things about the Uber model, is that you have all this flexibility. If you want to take this trip and then go home, you can do that. If you want to work 15 hours, you can do that. If you want to work 2 days a week, you can do that. If you want to drop the kids off of school, work for a while, and pick the kids up from school, you can do that. And that's been incredibly, I think, freeing and liberating for a large number of people, and which is why we've attracted so many drivers. And the vast majority of our drivers are doing it part-time.
Yeah. And how does the feedback of the rating system work?
That's very, very important, actually. One of the things we talked about background checks and so forth. One of the most important mechanisms for keeping the quality of drivers high on the network is the rating system. So every time you take a trip, as you all know, you rate the driver also rates you, and so those ratings are used in order to keep the bar high for the drivers. If you fall below a certain rating, or you get a sequence of poor ratings, that sort of thing, we'll investigate that. And if if customers are saying that you're driving erratically or whatever, you'll actually be warned and then eventually push off the network. And it's very meaningful and important for these drivers. I mean, they don't want to lose access to the Uber network, so they care about the rating, which means it just makes the whole network work better. And because riders are also rated, and now that became more and more visible to people over time, they're also on their best behavior as well. And everybody wants to get a good rating from the other people, the other person. So I think it creates a very healthy dynamic.
I know my daughter tells me she really wants to get good ratings from Uber drivers, so she is on extra good behavior.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to not get picked up.
Yeah, exactly. So what does Uber mean for the future of the oil industry? We had a very interesting discussion, oil panel earlier. We talked about big challenges the next 2 years, but how do you see the future of oil?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really interesting. Transportation is 25% of all oil consumption and all energy consumption in the world, and it's also roughly 20% of all the emissions in the world. So transportation is number 2 basically to industry with regard to the energy consumption. So moving the needle on transportation is extremely impactful on the energy equation. And the ride-sharing model in particular, and because Uber is the biggest, I guess Uber in particular, over time is going to have a profound effect, because the ride-sharing economically, as I mentioned earlier, drives us toward a more efficient vehicle, a longer-lived vehicle. It drives us toward kind of less waste of vehicles, less waste of land, and so on and so forth. But specifically with kind of oil, it drives us toward electric vehicles, because electric vehicles are just simpler. They just don't break. They have fewer moving parts. They don't just break down less often. And electrical energy generally is going to become abundant over time. It's going to become extremely inexpensive. When you start to incorporate solar, for example, and solar starts to get very, very cheap. I mean, the amount of energy that's hitting the planet's surface is many, many, many. I mean, hundreds of multiples of what we need as a species on this planet. And so, if we can actually harness that and then get that into the vehicles, we're gonna have a very, very different energy equation. So I think ultimately it drives us very much toward very low cost, abundant energy, and moving away from oil as a dependency for transportation.
Right. So this question is, with an array of electronic self-driving cars, does Uber build the first charging infrastructure, and do you surpass Tesla?
That's a good question. That's not our current plan. I mean, it's like we're not out building a charging infrastructure. That's a possibility though. It really comes down to how things play out in the world on this front, and we're ready to do electric vehicles, and we certainly have plans to do electric vehicles. But it comes down to like maybe it comes down to who builds the charging infrastructure, and we will be willing to do that if it's necessary in order to kind of catapult us past that point. Just not the current plan.
If self-driving cars make transport cheaper, does that mean more vehicle miles traveled? And it said more oil demand, but it said unless they're all EVs.
Right, exactly. So it all comes. The trade-off is how efficient are you on a per passenger mile basis, and versus the number of vehicle miles being driven. If your efficiency goes up by more than your vehicle miles goes up, then you net out in the right direction. And as I mentioned, I think it is trends toward essentially abundant, sort of free, roughly free energy. And so I don't see that as being an issue. Now the timing might not work out exactly. Like they might go through this kind of like lumpy pattern where we have an increase in kind of oil utilization in the near term, but over time it'll play out to the right place.
Right. So you've been involved in industries that have really disrupted traditional commerce, beginning with Amazon. Do you have any big takeaways from your experience at Amazon that inform what you do now?
That's a good question. I mean, dozens of things, but like, Amazon, one of the, I guess this is sort of an abstract answer, but one of the things that both Amazon and Uber do is start from first principles to invent. So instead of saying like, hey, what's going on in pattern matching in the world, Jeff Bezos said basically like, hey, look, if we centralize inventory, we should be able to do like 20 inventory turns where a normal industry, like electronics companies, for example, we're doing one. And so that should theoretically be possible. Like the physics says it's possible. Let's go try to build that. And in being inspired by the sort of first principles of the kind of possibility of that, we were able to power through a ton of barriers to get there. And another thing similarly I would say is just be a truth-seeking missile. Like it's sort of you don't put your head in the sand. Like look at the world the way it is, and sort of adapt to that. And some companies kind of like I mentioned earlier to you when we were talking, like you get stuck in a kind of a vortex of kind of believing your own, sort of kind of internal lines or defining your business based on what you're doing today. And you have to constantly be challenging yourself and looking out at sort of the next seed to plant. So there are many parallels between Amazon because they're both disruptive companies, right, that we could go on for hours about. But those are some.
What about willpower?
Well, yeah. Well, willpower is interesting. Like willpower, you definitely have to have perseverance. There's no question about it. You have to have some sort of internal motivation, and that motivation, I think, comes from this inside out, as we call it at Uber, inside out thinking. This kind of like first principles kind of thinking. When you're convinced that this is possible and this will be a much better world, this model that I built proves it. You are very motivated to go make it happen. And also oftentimes those insights are not common. Like you see that you kind of, if you do that kind of analysis, it's usually a rare thing to do. Most people don't think that way, so you tend to actually be able to get there before other people do. And you see Amazon doing this over and over again.
So give us a peek at the future. Uber's the present. You talked about transportation, air transportation. Tell us how that system might work.
Air transportation?
Yeah, what you're thinking about.
Yeah, it's literally push a button and get a flight. And so imagine that you are in Westchester and you want to get into the city, and you can choose between taking a train into Grand Central or pushing a button and having an aircraft land nearby. And these aircraft probably won't land in your yard. They might eventually do that, but that won't be the starting point.
How big will they be?
There'll be 5 passengers, we believe, 4 to 5 passengers, and eventually will be autonomous. They'll start off piloted, we believe. And there's really good reasons for that. It's another regulatory thing we have to work through. But these aircraft will be very much like cars are on the Uber network. They'll be dispatched on demand. And so you'll go to a nearby vertiport. If you're not very, very close to one, you can take an Uber to get there, and that multimodal thing will be handled for you. And you'll show up and you'll step onto an aircraft. The aircraft will take off. The aircraft will be electric, and you'll use what's called distributed electric propulsion. So it won't be like a helicopter. It won't be loud. It'll actually be very quiet. and it's quiet enough that it actually fades into the background noise of the city, so you won't feel like it's adding noise to your environment. And the reason it can do that is because it's not using internal combustion, it's all electric, and it's using many rotors as opposed to one. And by using many smaller rotors, the tip speed on the rotor is actually much lower, so the turbulence you create is much lower, and the noise scales with the fifth power of the speed of the speed of the tip. And so you want to keep that spinning less quickly if you can. So we'll do this, and the other thing is it'll be very safe because there's no single point of failure in an aircraft like that. So you'll be able to use this every single day and feel incredibly comfortable that you're actually much safer in the air than you even are in a car, which is kind of exciting. And you won't have intersections in the air. You're in 3 dimensions, so you won't have congestion. So a lot of the traffic that would normally be commuting on the roads will move into the air, and you'll just have this kind of like it'll be like kind of almost a romantic way of moving around, And these things will move. They'll move at 150 to 200 miles an hour to begin with. So as I mentioned, these trips will be trips that are normally an hour and a half kind of trip will happen in in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, that kind of thing.
So would we imagine 10,000 of those over Manhattan at the same time?
You won't look up and see 10,000 aircraft. Serving Manhattan would be on the order of several hundred to 1,000 aircraft. But the interesting thing is that's not that much air density, their density in the air. You won't look around and just see the air blackened with aircraft. Drones might have that characteristic. The smaller drones for drone delivery and so forth. But even there, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be quite sparse actually.
Right. And what are any discussions with the regulators so far?
Yeah, for sure. We've talked to the FAA and EASA, which is the FAA equivalent in Europe, and they're it's actually awesome. It's a great time to be doing this because they're much more open now and have better processes in place now to make something like this happen. And it's fairly clear what the path is through kind of the regulatory process. It's just not fast. And one of the things that's hard about with autonomy is it's never been done before. Except for autopilot, which is keeps you in flight in the air. There are very few airplanes that actually land themselves, and very few airports that can do it. And they need a lot of infrastructure to do it. We want to get ultimately to full autonomy, and because that makes it incredibly inexpensive. We believe we can get the price of these flights again beneath the cost of car ownership, which means it'll be economically more rational to fly than to drive your own car, which is amazing. But the way that only happens with autonomy, and to get there, we basically have to collect a ton of statistical evidence that autonomy is safe. And so we'll have to run that in parallel with piloted aircraft for a while, and then we'll be able to make that safety case.
Right. Well, Jeff, we know that what's happened with Uber has been both disruptive, but also, I suspect, for many people here in the audience, addictive, and has certainly changed their lives and changed travel. I think this began because you and Jason met and had a conversation about this. And in so many ways, the future of transportation is the future of energy. The future of energy is the future of transportation. On behalf of everybody, thank you very much for coming to this very illuminating discussion.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Dan. That was fascinating. I think we've kind of planned next year's agenda, which is a 5-hour conversation between Jeff and Dan about the future of mobility, which is extraordinary, and just like it was when we first met and we had a conversation about all this. And the whole day has been extraordinary and given us a long list of things to continue researching here at Columbia, not least of which has been the changes we've heard in technology, whether it's CCS, what Apple is doing on clean tech, the way mobility is changing, the way the shale industry is changing, and of course the importance of policy, the importance of markets. We talked about with the former Treasury Secretary and several of the world's top CEOs at some of the biggest companies and many others. And that's, as I said in the beginning, what we spend our time on here, thinking through issues in policy, technology, energy markets, and how to address all of these in a smart way and make better decisions in the public and private sector because the stakes are so high. So with that, let me draw the 2017 Global Energy Summit here at Columbia to a close. I want to thank all our speakers. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. The video of this event will be up online soon. Podcasts will be available on iTunes, Stitcher, your preferred podcast provider if you want to missed it or want to listen to it again. And please follow us on Twitter, take a look at our website, sign up for our distribution list, and hopefully please join us again soon in person or virtually for everything we have going on here at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. Thanks very much.